So I want to welcome you all to this morning's shenanigans. There will be 4 shenanigans in all methodologically aimed. I am one of the shenanigans somewhere in the middle. And our first shenanigan is Angela Fiedler. You know what? Pfammatter. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, you got it. Just ignore the P, like Pfizer. You're fine.
And I'm really looking forward to her talk. My name is Donna Sprout-Metz. I'm going to be your MC for this morning. We will just be going straight through. And there will be time for questions in between. Now, you are welcome to ask your questions in the chat. I will keep track of that. Make sure you either direct message me or hit everyone. And there'll be a time, for open questions after each talk. So I'm really, really happy to welcome you all here today and to introduce Angela. Angela is an assistant professor of preventive medicine at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and a licensed clinical health psychologist, which I'd forgotten because she's such a fantastic researcher, and that's how I know her. Her area of expertise is in the development of behavioral interventions through the use of mobile health technologies and optimization research methodologies. Her research focuses on multiple health behavior change to treat and prevent chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease, and her clinical expertise is in behavioral weight management. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Angela.
Thank you, Donna. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here, and it's really good to see some of you guys on my screen. I'm going to kick off today, this morning, with talking a bit about a broad picture of developing behavioral interventions from the standpoint of using some research frameworks to do things like enhance the way that we communicate with each other, to provide us some roadmaps for conducting research all along the way, in an effort to systematically build some of our mobile health tools and behavioral interventions. So I'm setting the stage for some of the other talks that you'll see later today and later on in the training. Let's see, why am I not advancing? Here we go. So my objectives for you are to, by the end of this talk, be familiar with what translational research frameworks are, to describe some frameworks that can be used for intervention development. I want you to hopefully be able to identify some use cases for frameworks, maybe even go as far as being an advocate for using those frameworks when appropriate, and to facilitate the use of such a framework in a team environment, in a multidisciplinary team environment, for the purpose of conducting behavioral intervention research. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of a question, and you can use the chat function to do this. I can see everything in the chat. But when I say, what is a translational research framework for behavioral intervention development, I'd like to know what comes to mind for you. Throw it into the chat. It can be an example, it can be words that come to mind, anything that pops in your mind when you hear the words translational research framework for behavioral intervention development. Take a moment and think about it, because it's a lot of words. And it may not mean anything to you, that's fine too. Thoughts, examples, what comes to mind? Something like the Orbital model. NIH model, COM-B framework. Yep. Set of principles to build connections between abstract and practical. Translation means getting from one place to another. A model that can be implemented. Yeah, this is good. So we're going to talk about all of this today, right? Like, what is a framework? What do we mean by translational research framework? How is that going to tie in with, behavioral intervention development? How is that different than things like intervention design? We're going to get into all of that. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat And I'll try to answer them as we go too, especially if you need clarification on something. So first of all, what do I mean when I say a framework? Because you could debate the actual definition of a framework, that's fine. But here I'm thinking of it as a guide or some kind of a system or a model for doing something. And in particular, what we're going to be talking about today is can be conceptualized more like a roadmap. And when I say roadmap, I'm really meaning like an old school roadmap, like you go buy that road atlas at the gas station, right? I'm not talking about, Google's turn-by-turn directions here. Something that can give you an idea about how to get from point A to point B. It can show you various options, but it's not going to make decisions for you. It's not going to tell you exactly which way to go. That's up to you as the researcher. So I'm thinking of these frameworks as roadmaps to get us from point A to point B with several options in between. And specifically for translational research frameworks, these are things that are going to get you from the bench to the bedside, or from an idea to a real world action, from basic research to dissemination of an intervention, from concept or proof of concept of an idea to a real world application. And specifically, the translational research framework should be able to give you a roadmap to systematically build the evidence base. And the goal here is to get your behavioral intervention or your mHealth tool out into the real world, out into the hands of the people that really need them. So why are translational research frameworks important? Well, we know that there is a wide research to practice gap. It's been written about several times. We've known that this is a significant problem for the better part of a decade. The estimate is that there's about this 17-year research gap. You'll hear that thrown around a lot, and that hasn't gotten much better. And a lot of that can be, you could argue, is because we have a lack of systematic evidence-based building of our behavioral interventions in such a way that facilitates their use out in the real world. Some of that could be because there's a lot of attention paid towards the gold standard of research, that is the randomized controlled trial. And we can do a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials and never really find something that works. But if we take a step back and we really work through from more basic research or early phase work, systematically investigating things that will work, we can get to the RCT in a better place and be more likely to find something that works and that can be disseminated. And we'll talk about how these frameworks do that. It can also help us match the stage of research to the research design. So in using that roadmap, the translational research framework can give us an idea about where we've been, what stage of research we're currently in, and where we want to go. And these frameworks can give us tools or research designs that can answer the next best question that's necessary to build the evidence base. So these translational research frameworks can act as a way of helping us to understand across our disciplines within a team where we're at with our science, what questions need to be asked next, and what research designs are most appropriate to answer those questions. And building on that, I think it can be used as a really great tool to enhance team communication, particularly when you're on a team, like many of you will be during this training, that includes multiple disciplines. You all come from different perspectives towards approaching a particular clinically important problem, health problem. And oftentimes what I find is that, especially, so I'm a clinical health psychologist, behavioral medicine researcher, but I work with a lot of computer scientists. And if I can more practically explain or precisely explain the state of my research, in a particular stage in this research framework, and I can get my colleagues to do the same, then we more quickly agree on what the next steps might be. We can also better understand or more quickly understand exactly, what stage that particular research is in. So to put it into something more concrete, if my computer scientist colleague comes to me and says, look, I can detect eating, that means something to me that may mean something completely different to them. I may think, oh, wow, you mean we can count calories, right? And that would be a assumption that there's some kind of work around in a particular stage of research, like efficacy research, that this particular technology has been used to measure calories accurately. But when the computer scientist sits down and talks with me about the stage of research that their science is in, they can say, oh, no. We're still back here at proof of concept. We have a device. We, can detect when somebody's moving their hand to their mouth. That to us is eating detection, but we haven't applied it in humans yet or out in the field yet. And very quickly we can see that we're each talking about different stages of research. So we can use the research frameworks as a way to enhance team communication in that way, understanding where the research has been, what stage we're at now, and where we're headed. Similarly, it can create some clarity in your grant applications. If you talk about your research framework from which you are approaching your work, the reviewer can very quickly understand what you're hoping to be testing in your particular grant application. They'll have a better sense of what you might know by the end of your grant project. And where you're headed next. You can very clearly define what stage of research you're in and how many steps more you may need to take before you get that intervention into dissemination. And finally, as I've said before, I think using the translational research frameworks gives us a tool to support the systematic building of the evidence base so that we don't skip steps or get all the way to the RCT, find an effective intervention and wonder why the heck we can't get it disseminated or put into the hands of the people that need them because we failed to recognize some early stage research that really needed to be done to support that. And before we get into the specific translational research frameworks, I want to spend a moment talking about what is not a translational research framework from my perspective, but has been shared by others. This paper that I reference at the bottom does a beautiful job sort of scoping these categories of frameworks that have been used in behavioral intervention development and really more closely defining the purpose of each of these frameworks in a way that I mostly agree with. And so I take this perspective here. The first is that it's not intervention design. I saw a few people mention a couple of things in the chat that I would consider to be intervention design. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when we are designing an intervention, we're sort of sucking the research process out of it, right? It is choosing the intervention methods or the ingredients that go into the intervention. And that can be anything from the content, the format, the timing, the delivery, all of those pieces that make an intervention what it is. So some examples of that would be things like COM-B, the behavior change techniques, behavior change wheels. Those kinds of models help us to identify those ingredients that are going to go into our intervention. What that model will not do, though, is direct you or guide you on how to evaluate it or how to systematically test it. It may also not provide very clear steps on how to get from A to B, from basic behavioral research to dissemination research. Some other examples, things like the Delphi process, where we use expert opinion or stakeholder engagement as a way of defining what is necessary to put into the intervention. Again, it's a method to create an intervention. It should absolutely, I mean, these techniques and models and whatnot, we'll talk about this later, should be used in tandem with the translational research framework. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying they don't have a place. They absolutely do. They should be used, but they should be used in tandem with a research framework. So the Delphi process can be one activity, one way of designing your intervention that you use before or in tandem with a research plan. Intervention mapping, same thing, right? It's a way to use behavioral theories to guide how the different components of your intervention are really going to work, identifying those mechanisms so that you can map out exactly what your intervention is doing and how you expect it to make change. Again, these are methods to choose content, format, timing, delivery, all those things, but they're not translational research frameworks. What is also not a translational research framework are things like conceptual or theoretical models. These would be things that inform or explain the choices made regarding those behavior change techniques, or predictors of behavior change, or the outcomes that you're interested in looking at. Some examples of those would be things like the Science of Behavior Change model, also referred to as SOBC. So if you've heard of this, you're very focused on identifying not just what works, but why it works. So identifying those mechanisms or those mediators that explain how your intervention is affecting its outcome. Again, can be used in tandem with a full translational research framework and should be. Social determinants of health, there are a lot of different models of social determinants of health. These are going to be models that help us to identify some of those really important predictors of how our interventions are working. Again, can be used in tandem with research frameworks, but is not a research framework, right? Doesn't tell you how to go from basic science to dissemination. Two other frameworks I'll just mention are REAIM and CIFER. They both have slightly different ways of approaching implementation science, but they're both models and frameworks used to define some of those really important outcomes that are necessary for implementation, or define some of those core concepts that we need to be targeting in order to implement our interventions. But they're not going to tell you how to evaluate those interventions other than to define those outcomes. So now that we've talked about what it's not, to be more clear, let's get into what are translational frameworks. So I'm going to take us back to a more medical model first. So in medicine, drug development, surgical intervention developments, research, we have these very clear stages that go from T0 to T4. And it starts with basic science research. These are your preclinical or animal studies. Here you're really focused on defining mechanisms, the specific targets of the intervention, perhaps some molecules involved in what it is that you're developing. And then from there, you take that basic science research and start to translate it into humans, usually first by proof of concept, small numbers there, phase 1 clinical trials. These are very briefly testing those new methods of diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. Once you're successful there, you move on to T2, where you're translating it into real patients. These are your phase 2 and 3 clinical trials in this T2 stage. Here we're doing very controlled, very tightly controlled studies to determine if it's effectively leading to the outcome that you're hoping for. And then when we're successful there, we'll move to T3, where we're translating it into real practice. These are your phase 4 clinical trials, clinical outcomes research, and it's really looking at the delivery of recommended and timely care to the right patient. And then finally, we're moving it out into the population for wide-scale dissemination. So if we look at this, it's very organized, linear. You can go back and forth to the stages as things are found to be effective or not effective, but it doesn't translate very well to behavioral intervention research. And so there's been a bit of a movement I would say in the last decade or so, to create something that is more meaningful or relevant for behavioral medicine. And so that's what we're going to get into, but this is sort of where it started and what is going to be really familiar to our physician colleagues or our pharma colleagues, things like that. So once upon a time, there was a push towards, again, trying to make these stage models more appropriate for things like behavioral interventions. And along came the NIH Stage Model. And there's been some update made to this in a more recent paper, but you can find it pretty easily online if you just Google NIH Stage Model. But here is the basic structure. So we start at stage 1, and you can kind of ignore all the arrows in the middle for the time being. But it's a way to sort of categorize where we're at in the translational research pipeline. So we start, with basic research, but then we move into stage 1. That's intervention, generation, and refinement. This is where most of us think about developing those intervention packages to affect the health outcome that we're interested in. From there, we move to stage 2, where we're doing more of our efficacy research. These are tightly controlled in research clinics. Moving into stage 3, once that's successful, to do more efficacy trials out with the community, not quite as tightly controlled. Once we're successful there, we moved into effectiveness, and then implementation and dissemination research. Now, the NIH Stage Model is great for just getting a snapshot of where we think we are in the research pipeline, but it doesn't provide a whole heck of a lot of guidance on what exactly goes on in each of these stages, or clear parameters for what types of research designs belong in each of these stages. But it is a good snapshot to start thinking about where your research might sit. But more recently, there have been some translational research frameworks identified and developed that kind of springboarded off of this to provide researchers with a more clear pathway or roadmap with more instructions, if you will, on how to get us from basic behavioral research into dissemination and implementation research. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So here I'll talk about three of the major examples that we can find in behavioral intervention research. The first is by the Medical Research Council. It's sometimes referred to as just MRC, but they put together some guidance on developing complex interventions. The second one we'll talk about is the Orbit model, which I saw was also included in the chat. It originally stood for obesity-related behavioral intervention trials. It's now used kind of beyond the obesity space. So most people just refer to it as the Orbit model. And then finally, we'll talk about the multi-phase optimization strategy, which you may have heard of referred to as MOST, which you'll also hear a lot more of during this training. All right, so we're going to start with the Medical Research Council framework. Here, they really center being able to consider the context in which your intervention is going to be used. And from that lens, you are developing, refining, testing, retesting these programs or interventions to fit the context. And that can include things like engaging stakeholders to make sure that things are going to be feasible at the end of the day, identifying key uncertainties that may put the intervention at risk for being disseminated, refining the intervention to be more efficacious or to be more acceptable or feasible, and then taking into consideration some core economic factors to make sure that you're not building something that is so, say, expensive that it never sees the light of day. They identify that you can really start from two different places, which is a little bit different than some of the other stage models that we'll talk about, because they sort of consider anywhere in the process as being a decent starting point. And it's not a linear model, as you can see. It's sort of a hub model that has all these interconnected arrows. But they identify that you can either develop an intervention from scratch, and that would be reasonable in certain contexts, or you can identify an intervention that already exists, either in the scientific literature that just, again, never saw the light of day, or is being implemented somewhere, say out in a community or in a medical center that you want to refine in some way to either use in a different context or to overcome some barriers or challenges that it's facing. And then there's 3 main activities that you're going to do with your intervention to, again, address those core elements. You're going to do things like testing feasibility, testing evaluation, testing the intervention through evaluation, and considering implementation as well. And again, this is not linear. It's also not very prescriptive. So when you look at the MRC framework, it's a very long document. It just got updated late last year, and I linked to it at the bottom here. Like I said, is not going to be very prescriptive, but what it does do is give you a really robust compendium of key considerations you need to be thinking of as you embark on fully developing and refining your intervention for the particular context. So it's not going to say do A, then B, then C. It's going to say, if you have an intervention, here are some things you need to consider. If your main barrier is that stakeholders don't find it to be feasible in their context, then you need to consider doing X, Y, Z. So it's going to give you a lot of guidance and things to think about. So it can be a really useful resource that way. It also becomes, again, going back to that team communication, it becomes a really great tool to start having those kinds of conversations with your team to understand where the big research questions are that still need to be answered before moving the intervention forward. The last thing I'll say about MRC is that this document also includes some really nice use cases for different trial designs and what kinds of research questions you can answer. It just doesn't fit it into very nicely packaged stages or phases. The second one we're going to talk about is Orbit. So Orbit has also gone through a pretty recent adjustment or update that is now in a book by Linda Powell, Ken Friedland, and Peter Kaufman that I've linked here at the bottom. And Orbit, as you can see in contrast to MRC, it is very staged. It is very linear. There is recognition that you can go back and forth from stage to stage, but you're not skipping stages here. And it all starts with discovery. Discovery to Orbit means you're finding a significant or important clinical question that needs to be answered. And you might do some basic behavioral and social science research to further define and refine what that question is and how it might be answered. You may go through some research activities to fully understand what could be done about the problem. What kinds of interventions have been tried before? What kinds of new interventions might be available to move into preliminary testing? And then from phase 1, you're going to go into phase 2 to do that preliminary testing, mostly doing things like proof of concept trials, feasibility trials, and those very tightly controlled phase 2 efficacy trials. And this is in an attempt to identify something that is going to produce a significant signal in the outcome that you're interested in. So here you might be doing a lot of little pilots. You're doing a lot of intervention design and testing to find things that are possible to move forward into efficacy. And one important part about Orbit is that you would not move from one stage to the next before you met some threshold that you set a priori. That is that you see a significant clinical benefit before moving to the next phase. So from phase 2, you're moving into phase 3 and you're doing your typical efficacy trials before you're moving into your more effectiveness trials. Now, this is going to look very familiar to medical colleagues. If you're working in the behavioral medicine space and you're working with other physicians or people that have been involved in drug trials or things like this, this one is going to feel the most familiar to them because it is very clearly defined phases from point A to point B. Now, in recent updates, they've included this optimization idea, as you can see on the bottom. And the idea here, as explained by Orbit, is that you should be thinking about optimizing your intervention all along the way. And by optimization, they sort of mean the idea that it becomes more and more efficacious, that it can be delivered in the context for which you are designing. Now, the last one is the multi-phase optimization strategy, otherwise known as MOST. And you'll hear quite a bit about, I think, this particular research framework during the course of this training. The best explanation of MOST is from a book by Linda Collins, but she also has a website that she keeps pretty regularly updated at NYU now that has some of the more recent updates included on it. Here, it's a phased approach, so it's similar to Orbit in that way, where you don't really skip over stages, right, on your way from basic science to dissemination. It starts with preparation. And here, preparation can mean a lot of things. This is where your pilot work is going to happen. This is where some of your intervention mapping might happen, or your Delphi process might happen, where you're designing what the intervention is going to look like. But specific to this particular strategy, you're actually going to be thinking a lot about how to break down your intervention into testable components. And this is sort of an idea that is, not sort of, it is an idea that is taken from engineering, where we break down processes into its smallest components so that you can test them and optimize the process, take away the things that are not working and add in things that are working under certain resource constraints. And you can see we also have two other themes that are borrowed from engineering: the resource management principle, where you're always considering what resources you have available to you, and the continual optimization process or principle. And that is that you're never done optimizing, because there can always be more to be optimized, because, you know, technology changes, or people change, or the context change, or you have a pandemic, things can happen, right? So we're always continuing to optimize. So we do preparation, we lay the groundwork for the optimization phase. Then we go into optimization, and I'll say here just briefly that sometimes people confuse the optimization research methods with the full strategy or the full framework. This is what I would consider to be a full translational research framework, because it can take you all the way from basic science to dissemination, right? But I think because of the way it got introduced out into the field, it came along with these new optimization trial designs like factorial experiments, SMARTs, and micro-randomized trials. And so sometimes people conflate the whole strategy with a particular research design. So they'll say, I'm doing a MOST, but that doesn't make any sense. You're actually doing a factorial experiment underneath the umbrella of the full translational research framework, which is the multi-phase optimization strategy. But here in optimization, we're going to take those components and we're going to test our interventions in ways that allows us to identify experimentally what can be removed, what can be added, under what resource constraints. And we can do several different trial designs there that depends completely on our research question. But again, we are focused on optimizing that intervention before we ever get to RCT. And the whole goal here is that we never get to the RCT until we're pretty sure that the package is going to be successful. And we know that because we've identified the interventions that actually meet our criteria for success or our optimization objective. So after optimization in this framework, we move on to evaluation if and only if the optimized intervention is expected to be sufficiently effective, right? We're not going to waste research dollars and resources on an RCT on an intervention that we're not pretty sure is going to work. And once we get into evaluation, the RCT is still our gold standard for building evidence, but you've gone into this with more evidence about what might work. And that's not the only activity that can be done in evaluation, but it is the one that's most commonly talked about. But you could also do some implementation trials in here as well. So how do they compare? I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because they can be quite different. So going back to MRC. MRC, in contrast to some of the other two that I presented, does give you a little bit more direction on all of the considerations you need to hold or think about when you are dealing with a complex intervention. And by complex, we mean has multiple components, maybe has a very complex context in which it needs to be implemented, maybe has a lot of moving parts or a lot of people involved. And so in that way, it can give you a little bit more guidance than some of the other research frameworks do. And again, as I said before, it can serve as a really great tool for team communication in that way. It also really calls out and focuses in on this idea that you can take interventions that are already out there and you can do some work in order to make them more implementable in other contexts in a way that the other frameworks really don't. The other frameworks sort of implicitly have this understanding that you're going to start at the very beginning and very methodically build up your intervention. Not that you would necessarily start with something out of the box. You can, but it's not explicitly called out. Here, it's a main focus. You might have a behavioral intervention or an mHealth tool that's out there in the field already that just needs some tweaking or some of these elements addressed in order to be used in another context where it could be helpful. And then lastly, I think the MRC is actually very useful if research trial design is not your strong suit. Particularly if you're in a discipline where you didn't get a lot of training on matching your research question to the trial design. MRC and the companion documents can actually give you a lot of information on under what conditions you would use which trial designs. And it gives you a lot of use cases, a lot of case studies, if you will. And so it can be a really great primer in that way to fully understand the translational research pipeline and what trial designs might be necessary all along the way. When we get to Orbit, it's a little more prescriptive and it's a little bit more restricted in some ways. As I said, you're really starting from the beginning and working your way all the way up through effectiveness. You're going to get some explicit instructions on what trial designs are really necessary for each of these stages. The caveat to that is that when it comes to optimization, although it is talked about in the framework, you're not given any sort of guidance on specific research trial designs that are going to help you achieve optimization, particularly in the way that we'll discuss in a minute with most. And you're also expected to meet benchmarks along the way, regardless of, say, the context that it needs to be adapted to. This could be a really useful framework, particularly when you have very constrained interventions that can't tolerate a lot of change, either because of the context or the way in which it's designed, or maybe it's a simple one component type of intervention. This would be a good place to use Orbit. Orbit can also be a really good model if you don't have a lot of constraints to consider. You don't need to be asking those kinds of questions that MRC is going to have you ask, or you don't need to optimize to meet certain resource constraints like most is going to have you do. So if you just need a very effective intervention, maybe it's very simple, maybe it's one or two components, and maybe you'll do it regardless of the cost or resources, then this could be a good model. This is also going to be very, again, familiar to your medical colleagues or pharma colleagues. And so it may be a good tool for communication that way, because this will look very familiar to them. And then lastly, the multi-phase optimization strategy. This can be in relation to the other two frameworks. If you have an intervention that you are trying to develop, particularly developing from scratch, you know, and you want to make sure that you are meeting from the get-go all of the resource constraints that you know are going to be present in your context, then using MOST might be a really good strategy, because you can identify what treatment components you have. You can identify the resource constraints that you have and sort of start building that from preparation, with the full implementation and dissemination in mind. Okay, so I'm not going to put together a package for testing that can't possibly be implemented out in the field, which has happened in behavioral medicine again and again and again. We end up with very cool interventions that work, but can't ever leave the lab. So this can be a good way to have some good direction on how to prevent that from happening. And it does that through a very systematic process by which you are kind of tearing apart your intervention. You are creating different tests of those components, either whether or not they work or the sequence in which they work. And so in this way, in contrast to something like Orbit, MRC to some extent, optimization is paramount, it's central, but there's also a lot of direction on how to optimize. It's not just that you should optimize, it's that it's necessary to optimize, and here's some tools to do that. And again, we're not getting into that evaluation phase until we have something that can possibly be implemented within our context. The other thing I'll say here about that's not really explicated in the graphical depiction of the model is that some of these newer research trial designs are able to give you efficacy data on several different components at a time. And in that way, they can be highly efficient research designs. So you may not be able to build just one intervention package at the end of an optimization trial design. You might actually have several options that might be more appropriate for different contexts. So for example, you could get to the end of optimization and one investigator could say, you know what, in my context where I'm trying to implement this, in this clinic, we're willing to pay, you know, $800 per patient to get this intervention that is effective. But another investigator may come along and say, well, I don't have $800, but I have $300. And based on this one trial, I'm able to see that this other combination of components can be put together and used in this particular context. And so it's not as linear necessarily as the graphical depiction makes it out to be. And it's certainly in contrast to something like Orbit, because you can get to the end of an optimization phase and you're actually disseminating data that other investigators could use. And they're really starting from an evaluation standpoint because you've already done the optimization trial. So moving on a little bit, when should I use a framework? So based on what you've heard so far, this is like, wake up if you haven't been paying attention or if it's still really early in your time zone. I'm going to have you throw into the chat just some initial thoughts based on what I've talked about so far. When might you use a framework like Orbit or MRC or MOST in your research program? And do you think it would be helpful, not helpful? Where are you at right now? Just some initial thoughts. At all stages, especially when conceptualizing a new study, laying out aims and grant application, always great for grants. I love that you guys are talking about grants, because I do think it is one place where it can really enhance the comprehension of what you're trying to do with your research program in a really accessible way to reviewers. Always, we should be thinking about dissemination and scalability from the get-go, right? Because what else are we doing if we're not doing that? I guess there's, some value in doing science for science sake, but when we're out here trying to do health research, particularly if you're going to get funded by the NIH, for example, we really need to be paying attention to getting those interventions out of the lab. Yeah, we can talk about how to show this framework and conceptual models and in a grant. There's definitely different ways to do that. So yeah, my stance is that we should always use one. And not only should we always use one, we should report when we're using one too. So most papers, at least in behavioral medicine, are not going to tell you if they used a research framework or what stage they were conducting the research that you're reading about. And I think it does a disservice to accelerating our science. And in particular, I think we should also be consistently talking about what frameworks we're using. And that's not just for translational research frameworks, although I think that's a good base, because it can be informative for your research pipeline. But we need to talk about the other frameworks we're using too. And using frameworks and having consistent use of frameworks across all of behavioral medicine, I think can do a lot more to accelerate our science, to close that research to practice gap. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to proliferate these one-off trials or one-off concepts or constructs that aren't being replicated in other people's science. And again, is not systematically building the evidence base. So how do you choose a framework? It really depends on a lot of different things. So one can be your actual intervention design. So going back to thinking about intervention design, regardless of the intervention design framework that you use, the way in which you develop it and systematically evaluate it and build it through building that evidence base can depend on several different things. We talked a little bit about the components, right? If I have a single component, I might use Orbit. If I've got multiple components, I might use something like MOST, particularly if I've got resource constraints. If it's really complex and I've got tons of components all over the place, I might look at MRC to make sure I'm sort of covering my bases. So it can depend on the components. It can also depend on the types of constraints that you have. If there are not many changes you can make to your intervention to respond to certain constraints, then a more simple staged approach like Orbit might be a good framework. But if you have the ability to take out or add in certain components to respond to constraints, then something like MOST might be more appropriate. The complexity certainly matters as well. As I said, MRC gives you a lot more guidance on all of the different factors you need to be considering when your intervention and the use of the intervention and the context gets very complicated. And then again, the context matters. There's a lot more emphasis on knowing your context and designing for it and developing intervention with it in mind in frameworks like MRC and MOST as compared to Orbit. But your science also matters. And when I say science, I mean in your area of research interest, the thing you're working on, the problem you're solving, the tools you're using to solve it, what is the current evidence base for those things? The state of your science matters in terms of what kinds of research frameworks you're going to choose. Does it exist? Does your intervention exist already? Right? We talked about how MRC gives you a little bit more guidance on what to do when there's already an intervention in place somewhere. And how do you go about either changing the context or changing something about the intervention to make it more efficacious, for example. MOST and Orbit are both a little bit more mute on the idea of taking an existing intervention and then putting it back into earlier phase research. There's certainly an implicit assumption in MOST that you would be able to take an existing intervention and further optimize it. So from that perspective, it's certainly doable, but it is more of a central theme in MRC. Again, we want to consider the current evidence base. Where is the evidence base with the tool that you're using or the intervention that you're using? What stage are you starting in? Is it early or late? Where do you need more guidance, right? If you are already at this stage where you're ready to implement your intervention, MOST is not going to give you a whole lot of guidance there. Neither is Orbit. MRC may be a different or a better framework to be using because it is going to go into some more detail about testing implementation. Alongside this, your research questions matter. What are the questions you have? If you have questions that are more inherently about optimization, that is, how do we keep this one intervention to be most effective or more effective, but cheaper because insurance won't pay for it, as an example, or how do I make this one intervention, continue to be effective, but take up less time because our patients are really overburdened. Those are optimization types of questions that need an optimization design that would fit under something like MOST, that you're going to struggle to find guidance on from something like Orbit, for example. So sometimes your research question can actually be the driver of which translational research framework you're using. And the last one's a little sticky, and that is, it depends on who's funding it too. There are certain calls that you may see, requests for applications, that are going to ask you to use very particular frameworks. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And so you need to be responsive for that. I wouldn't go writing a grant for an RFA that explicitly asks for Orbit with why I'm not using Orbit and I'm using MOST instead. That would be suicide, right? Like, you're not going to do that kind of thing. You're going to really threaten your ability to be funded there. So sometimes it's about who's funding it. It's also important to know, like, who's on your study section, who's reviewing your grant. Is it, board members that are lay business people? Is it people at other researchers in your field? And what kinds of frameworks are they familiar with? Because sometimes if you go against what's already known, you're going to get more pushback, and you have to just decide if you can tolerate that. So sometimes it does matter who's funding it. All right, but we're going to come back to the big question. Why? I argue that we should be using translational research frameworks always, and we need to be talking about them more, and we need to be reporting them. And it's really because of these reasons. I think we can be very inefficient in the way that we do behavioral research, and I think that using a translational research framework can reduce those inefficiencies, because we can clearly plan out what kinds of evidence we already have, what question needs answering next, what questions still need to be answered before we can get into dissemination, and we can more clearly plan what that research pipeline looks like. I also talked a lot about how it can facilitate that cross-disciplinary understanding of the research pipeline. I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in when we realize that, say, like a piece of technology is way over here in proof of concept land, while us behavioral medicine people are like, yeah, we can already do this intervention. We're over here like almost to evaluation or almost to effectiveness, but we need a tool that's still over here in proof of concept land. And so we need to be understanding of where each other's sciences are. And those frameworks can really help us to identify, so you can sort of sit down with each other, look at the pipeline and say, no, we're still way over here. Like, we need to play catch up, or we need to take some steps back. It can also, and this is a little sticky one, it reduces the confusion between the intervention design, which is like all of those ingredients that go into your intervention, right? The stage of research in one of those phases or stages, right? and the trial design itself. There are some trial designs that definitely fit better in some stages versus others, but that doesn't mean that it's always the case that a trial design has to be done or used within a particular phase. One example I can think of is, sometimes people will say do a factorial design, which you'll hear, if you haven't already, more about. But they want to run a pilot just to make sure that they can handle like that many, randomized conditions, for example. But they call it an optimization phase trial, just because it's a factorial trial, but it's not. If it's not fully powered, it's not an optimization trial. It's a preparation stage trial, right? Because you're still running a pilot, right? But it can help when we talk about the full model, the full translational research framework, and we are, using it as a tool for communication, we can better place where our research activities are, and then enhance the understanding across these things. It's not that trial designs have to occur within a particular stage of research. It really matters the stage of research that you're in. And that's one thing that the frameworks can help us do. It also aids in, and this is like a companion to that, in actually matching those research questions to the right trial design. Like I said, MRC and its companion materials are a bit better at giving you some clear guidance on how to do that. But there are a lot of examples out there where people think they're answering a particular research question, but they've actually chosen the wrong research trial design to answer that question. But using these frameworks and their companion materials can help us make those right choices. I also think it makes the next steps more apparent, that what's next, what do we do next, is a lot less muddy when we use these kinds of frameworks. And it may not be, I'll make the point that it may not be that you need to be the one to do the next. So remember, we're spanning the entire, from basic behavioral research all the way to dissemination. There are certainly, scientists that spend their entire career in a lab doing basic behavioral studies. Those may not be, and maybe shouldn't be, the same people that go and do large clinical trial for testing effectiveness, right? But we can more clearly hand off these pieces of research to those colleagues that have more expertise in those later stage research stages, if we're more clear about what stage we are operating in and what we think the next step is, making it more apparent, not just to us and not just to our funders or even the journals, but when we write about it in that way, we could be raising awareness for other investigators to sort of pick up the ball and carry it forward. And ultimately, I think it supports the systematic building of the evidence base so that effective behavioral interventions can actually make it into the hands of the people that need them. And I think, or at least that's what I'm doing. I hope that others are doing that as well. So in summary, I just wanted to revisit some of the objectives I had, and that is to help you be familiar with translational research frameworks, to be able to describe some of the frameworks for the purpose of intervention development, to identify some use cases or some scenarios where it might be more advantageous to use one framework over another. And hopefully, especially as you get into your project groups, that you can start thinking about using the frameworks in a team and facilitate that use through those conversations that you're going to have in your multidisciplinary teams. I've included some of the key resources here at the end as well. I think that's it. Let's see what we got in the chat.
Thank you so much, Angela. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining all those things to me. Because I really do have trouble with differentiating them and deciding which one to use. We've got some questions here.
Yes.
So
I did want to address the, there was a couple folks brought up, how do you write about this in a grant application when you've got multiple frameworks going on, right? Like, it can sort of feel a little bit like the battle of the frameworks going on in your significant section. And that's not what you want to do, because you don't want to, like, really confuse the reviewers, like which framework are they using. So I think you can handle it in several different ways.
Angela, while you're
Yeah.
talking, do you mind stopping your screen share so that people can see you better?
Yeah.
Thanks. Great.
Oh, that's much better. Hi, everyone. So I think a lot of it has to do with just being very specific about what framework you're using and for what purpose, because each of those frameworks have a different purpose. So you could say, I am using the Orbit model to guide the work, the stages of research that I'm going to tackle in this particular application. We are going to do stage 2 or the phase 2 in the Orbit model in this application prior to moving on to phase 3 in a future application. So you can sort of ground it that way. But then when you get to, the things that we're going to be testing in this application, were put together by using intervention mapping framework to develop or design the intervention. And here's how we did that, right? So a lot of it just has to do with just being very specific about what you're using for what purpose and what that affords you in that grant application. I've seen a couple of folks try to also graphically depict that with varying levels of success. And I think it really depends on which frameworks you're trying to use at the same time. So it would be very easy, for example, to throw like a Delphi process into the preparation phase of MOST, for example, right? And you can just write that in your preparation phase box. These are the activities we're doing. It may be more complicated to model something like, okay, we're going to look at this intervention problem or development from, using Orbit, from a lens of using social determinants of health, and choose your own, framework there. Depicting that in some way, maybe you have because SDOH are more like predictors, right? You may have a harder time depicting that because those predictors are, or you may have a hard time graphically depicting that because those predictors are things that you're going to measure. They're not necessarily parts of your research trial design that would, nicely fit into one of those phases. So you may need to graphically depict that in some different way.
I see a question here from Yu Kuai. We are considering including machine learning, reinforcement learning that will consistently receive outcome feedback for optimizing the intervention. So the optimization phase is included in the evaluation phase of the MOST model. Is that right?
These are my favorite questions. So it sounds like, and this is an assumption, it sounds like you are actually potentially have a research trial design embedded in another research trial design. Would that be accurate to say? Like you're doing an evaluation of, say, an RCT of an intervention, but then you're testing, say, like the messaging or something.
You
okay.
You can unmute and say words.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, we're just having this idea, but the thinking behind is that, as you know, the reinforced learning requires a lot. Like the more data you get, the better outcome. Because we're thinking about using that to select the messages that will be most effective. So the more information you get from or feedback from, the participants, the better selection you will make. And therefore, it will be really hard to do a small study to do the for the optimization phase, and then do a randomized trial. So I thought it would make sense to have a large trial, but during the time, it's the machine learning will proceed with the optimization process.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on there, and I think the key to figuring that out is to go back and identify what your research questions are for each activity that you're doing. So for example, when you say reinforcement learning, you're talking about optimizing the intervention, but it's not an optimization process from a research perspective, right? You are assuming that the reinforcement learning has already taken care of that optimization process and that it will work better. I didn't hear a question. It didn't sound like you were asking the question, is reinforcement learning better than not reinforcement learning? Is that accurate? So then the question is, what do you think you're evaluating then?
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Oh, well, no, it was the question.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, no, so I think the question at the end of the day, we're focusing on the clinical outcome. I think so. Right now, I think it was the thinking behind is that the full package, including the messages and also the machine learning process or a selection of messages, the entire package will actually lead to a better clinical outcome. I think that was compared to people who never received any of the messages.
Okay, so that is evaluation, right? You're optimizing your algorithm, but you're not using a research framework to do that optimization. You're relying on the fact that reinforcement learning works. It sounds like you've already made that determination somehow. But what you are actually testing is, does this whole package, which includes reinforcement learning to send messages, is more effective than not receiving those messages? And that is an evaluation question that I hope you've already evaluated or optimized to answer. Where I thought you were going is testing optimized or a reinforcement learning determined message against like a package of messages. And if you were to do that and say something like a micro-randomized trial where each instance of sending a message used a different algorithm, that would be an optimization question, right? Because you're trying to figure out what, which type of messaging system or algorithm works best. And then you might carry that forward into the evaluation trial that you just described. So regardless of the framework you're using, that conversation alone, this back and forth we just had, right, could be very useful for the entire team to get on the same page about what the research question really is and which stage of research we're really in, right? And how that's going to drive what type of trial design we're using.
Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And you're right, Carrie, we have to be careful about our language. And that's why I often start some of these conversations with, when I say optimization, I mean blah, right? Or when I say model, I mean blah, right? Because those things mean very different things depending on the discipline that you're talking about, right? Where's a full-scale factorial trial fit in? And which of these frameworks would you suggest for the grant? So the full-scale factorial trial, I think what you mean by full-scale is fully powered. A fully powered factorial trial is an optimization trial and goes in the optimization phase. In terms of which of these frameworks I would suggest for a grant, it depends. It depends on your research question. It depends on who's funding it. It depends on, the rest of your team. So I advocate for using a framework, not a particular one. Although I'm probably most known for talking about most. I think, as long as you're using some kind of framework and being explicit about it, it can be really helpful regardless of the one you use, as long as it makes sense. But again, I wouldn't go into, if you're going to do a factorial trial, I would probably not use the Orbit framework because it's not really explicated in that framework, right? So I've provided the resources primarily so that you can go learn more about each of them to figure out which one fits your research questions best. Other questions?
I have one if nobody else does.
Sure.
So the trouble I have with almost all of these research frameworks is that, to be honest, I think they're really important. And I think that we're always using a research framework and it's implicit in our minds. So it's best to just get it out there and make it explicit and choose a pony.
Yeah.
Choose the pony that, runs the race that you're interested in.
Yeah.
But in any grant that you write is not going to cover the whole cycle.
Yes.
And I kind of like the idea of relay race. It's like I am a certain place in the cycle kind of girl.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't like running a clinical trial. Thank you very much. I like doing some of the earlier work, as you guys will see in a couple of hours when I get down into the weeds and tell you the little tiny things I like to play with. So I'm always in that phase.
Yeah.
I'm at the same phase in the most framework always, because that's my favorite phase. And then I like to hand it off.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also really good to realize that when you choose a framework, I don't think you have to think of yourself as doing the whole thing. Right?
In fact, it's probably best that you don't think of it that way. Right? Because you could either hand it off to a colleague, right? Donna can hand her stuff off to me because I run clinical trials.
Thank you.
Right? I'll gladly take that, Hey, it's another grant idea, right? But the other thing you could think about too is that it could serve to just be your entire career's work, right? You start at preparation. By the time you're an associate professor, you're doing optimization. By the time you're a full professor, you're doing evaluation, right? You could do that.
Yeah, people do that. It's amazing.
Yeah, they do. So you could think of it either way, but no, you would not. I mean, I can't think of a good example where you would try to tackle an entire translation from soup to nuts.
No, actually, I can only think of bad examples of that.
Exactly, right? Maybe some simple interventions that aren't about people. I don't know.
Yeah, even organisms that are very small are complicated. Though.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
Somebody Carrie wants to know if we're going to get copies of your presentation.
I assumed we were recording it for a reason. Do they not get posted to the?
Yes,
they will be posted. I think she's asking about the slides. Maybe.
The references.
Oh, I mean, Lindsay, can I just email them to you? You can,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sure thing. Or Carrie, if you want to reach out to me directly too, that's fine. I'm just Angela at northwestern.edu.
Okay, yeah, I want to review all that.
Yeah.
And I didn't write them all down, so thank you.
Yeah, sure.
All right. We have 2 more minutes. Anybody would like to fill them?
I'd just like to ask a very sort of simple, pragmatic question. When you're working with people who are not experienced either in clinical trials or in behavioral research, is there any difficulty in getting them to adhere or work on a specific behavioral theory?
Sorry.
Oh wow, that question took several turns. Because when I first thought this is not a simple question at all.
No, it's not simple at all.
Yeah, because I was thinking sometimes I've worked with people who are a lot more on the biological side, and so sometimes even getting them to do things that we do in normal clinical trials is sometimes difficult. So when I think about saying that we're going to operate on the orbit model, I could just see their eyes get a little bit of trepidation there. So I was just wondering how that experience has been, and if there's any pointers for how to best implement that in an actual research team.
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll say about that. One is that it's sort of a quintessential team science problem, right? And I think so much of our science these days needs to be transdisciplinary, really, because we need each other's areas of expertise to overlap to really find the answers to the really tough problems that we currently face, right? The easy stuff has been done, right? So I think one answer to your question could be from that perspective to say, it is up to us as scientists to try to create situations that are psychologically safe within our teams such that we can rely on each other to bring to the table our certain expertise and to trust the other individual to not only bring theirs, but to use it to its fullest extent. So with my colleagues, like what you're describing, it's very much a, hey, you don't do clinical trials, but I do, right? Like, this is my baby. Like, this is the stuff I know and I know really well. I'm going to leave this stuff I don't know very well with you. That's why you're here, right? And we need to trust each other and, you know, bounce it off of each other. So like, I think we need to be using this certain framework. This is why, and creating a collaboration that really, trust is the best word I can use for that, but can play off of each other that way. But the other thing you talked about was like getting people to use behavioral theory, which is a completely separate problem, but sort of the same solution. You know, I went so far as to have one of my computer science colleagues take my course on behavior theory in the public health program. I wouldn't suggest necessarily going that far. However, you can have those kinds of conversations to say like, look, my science in behavioral medicine in particular values greatly the use of theory. Because there's a lot of things that happen in the human space that you can't directly measure, like, you know, you can with a piece of technology. You know, it's either working or not, or it's using a certain number of megabytes or it's not. Battery life is a certain amount or not, whatever. I don't mean to make it sound that simple, but it's not as concrete, right? And so we need behavioral theory. And that is like asserting, this is the state of my science. This is what is valued in my science. I also want to know what's valued in your science. Okay. You know, it's sort of like this, the same thing happens, like we, you know, in behavioral medicine want to be in like high impact journals, right? Where, you know, our computer science colleagues, they need to be at these, you know, big competitive conferences, and it looks like a conference abstract. And we're like, why is that, you know, interesting? And why is that your currency for how well you're doing in your science, in your field, right? Yeah. It seems weird to us, but that is the norm there. And we need to respect those norms and have those kinds of conversations.
Okay, great.
That was probably more than what you were looking for, but it was not a simple question like you advertised.
Yeah, I was just interested because I was thinking about like your first meeting, your first study related meeting. You're like, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to approach it. So, you know, just for folks that are not in that field, I could see it being a little bit interesting. You're like, this is a very different way than we're used to working. So I was just curious about experiences with that. Yeah.
You know, that, Damon, that's a great question, and it's going to be addressed throughout this training. Yeah. Again and again. I'm going to be talking about it too, but right now I have to let you guys go because it's my job as an MC to let you go, because we have a break now, and then we are going to come back in 15 minutes, I believe, for Bonnie Springs talk. So go for it and be strong and wonderful, and I'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you, Angela. Great talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.